When we're talking about social networks and politics, we have to consider two types of networks. There are general discussion networks and political discussion networks. General discussion networks are the people who you talk about things generally. Like your friends, your family, your coworkers, your acquaintances. Political discussion networks are the people who you talk about politics. Now, it could be that that is some subset of the general network, right? I talk to my father about sports and also politics, but perhaps I only talk to my friend Bill about sports. I don't talk to him about politics. So in that case, my father would be in both my general discussion network and my political discussion network. Bill would only be in my general discussion network. Now, one of the big questions about these sort of networks is how much choice do you have, right? You have your family, you have your neighbors, your coworkers, and your friends, and you only get to choose your friends. Okay? In terms of political discussion, your family, your neighbors, and friends are often going to have very similar political opinions. Most of the disagreement you're going to find is going to be with your coworkers. Okay? These are the people who you cannot choose, but also the people who you didn't grow up with, right? And the people who you grew up with, you sort of influence one another, you socialize one another. So if you grew up in a Democratic family in a Democratic neighborhood, you're probably going to be a Democrat. Okay? And if you grew up in a Republican family in a Republican neighborhood, you're probably going to be Republicans. But then, perhaps you then go to work and you're a Democrat seated next to a Republican, right? You grew up in the Democratic neighborhood, that other person grew up in the Republican neighborhood, and that's why you're going to have this disagreement over politics. It's really not as simple as all that, because you still get to choose to some extent, right? Because you can't choose the fact that that person is going to be your coworker, but you can choose what you talk to that person about, and also how frequently do you talk to that person. There is this piece by Ada Finifter, which is one of your assigned readings, and you'll note that in that reading, there are all these auto workers, and they're mostly Democrats, but there are a few Republicans, and those Republicans tend to hang out together in friendship groups. When deciding whether or not to talk to someone about politics, there are pretty much two things that people will consider. The first is expertise in politics, and they really value expertise. They think that the people who know more about politics, they should talk to them more about politics because it will help them gain some information. But it's also the case that the people who are more expert in politics talk about politics a lot. They talk about politics more because it's the thing they know, it's the thing they typically are interested in. Okay? It is important to note that just because someone talks a lot about politics doesn't mean they're an expert in politics. Though, as we'll see later on, it often does mean that I think you're an expert in politics. So besides expertise, the other factor people will consider in determining whether or not to talk to someone about politics is agreement. And people will tend to talk to people with whom they agree. Note, that does not mean they only talk to people with whom they agree, just that they tend to do it more than not. Now, it's sort of a tricky, complicated thing here. When we talk a lot about politics with somebody, we realize that we disagree more than we thought. Okay, maybe we talked about social issues a lot and we agreed on all those, so we moved on to economic issues. We found out we actually disagreed there. When we realize we disagree about politics, we talk about politics less. Okay, maybe we don't disagree about movies, so we start talking about movies. And then we eventually forget that we disagreed and we start talking about politics more again. But of course, that brings us back to the beginning, because the more we talk about politics, the more we realize we disagree about politics. And we remember that. So you end up in this circle of ebbs and flows of people talking about politics more and then less, and it comes and goes. What you might be asking yourself is, how do we know who's in someone's social network? Okay, that's tricky at the interpersonal level. Usually we use surveys to figure this out. Now there's two ways of doing the surveys. One is you take a group, say a school or a dorm room or some sort of organization, and then you, in that case, have the names of everybody who's in the group. And so you just say to somebody, do you ever talk to this person? Are you friends with this person? You give them the entire roster of everybody in the group and you have them check them off. That's actually the perfect way to do it if you want to do some proper social network analysis, because that gives you everybody. It gives you the entire network. It shows all the connections between all the individuals. But a lot of times that's limiting. So we could look at the sort of social network of one of the dorms on campus, but for any individual, one of you who lives in a dorm, Well, that's going to leave out a lot of people who are actually in your social network. It would probably leave out friends who live in different dorms, friends who live off campus, all your family, friends who don't go to this school. Okay, and so that's a problem, you know. And maybe we'll be picking up on relationships that aren't uh, that are not that strong, and leaving out more intimate relationships. So maybe you're very close to your sister, but your sister doesn't live in the dorm, so she's out. And once a week, you have lunch with some guy on your floor. Well, okay, well now he's in the network and she isn't. Okay, if we're looking at who you're most intimate with and who's most important, what we'll do a lot of times with surveys is what's called look at the ego network. And in that case, we'll say, is there anybody who you talk to about politics or important matters? And you might say yes. And if you say yes, we'll ask you for that person's name. And then we'll ask you some questions about that person. If you say, then we'll follow up with, is there another person? And you say yes again. And so we'll ask you some questions about that person. And we'll go on and so forth. The problem with this method is, it takes a lot of time to ask all these questions about these individuals. So typically, the survey will stop after your first 3, 4, or 5 people who you name. So based on that, we can create this ego network. It's called the ego network instead of a social network because it doesn't actually show everybody who you're tied to and the ties amongst all those people. It's just you and who you are tied to. What we do with these surveys is we look at the information you provide us about those other people, those people who you talk to about politics. And we ask them, let me ask you certain things like how often do you talk? When you talk, how often do you disagree? What party do they tend to support? How close are you really? Are they your spouse, a relative, a coworker? Who are they? Maybe ask some questions about their demographics, their education level, ethnicity, age, so on and so forth. Okay? And that gives us some information about how you perceive these other people. So for example, it may say that you think, well, that person who I talked to is very knowledgeable about politics. And that person may or may not be. We don't know how good you are at evaluating that. So sometimes they'll do what's known as a snowball survey, and they'll ask that person. They'll take the people you named in your ego network and survey them. And we can ask them questions about, different matters to sort of find out, well, who do they actually support? How much do they actually know about politics? Okay? It's sometimes a question, though. What matters, the perception or the reality? If I'm a Republican and I think my friend Sally is a Democrat, but she's actually a Republican, if I'm behaving with her as if she's a Democrat and maybe trying not to talk about politics because we would disagree, well then that's really what matters. It doesn't matter that we actually agree. One of the other articles will point out in spousal relationships, husbands and wives often think they disagree when they tend to agree more often than other sort of pairs of individuals. Again, agreement is really important, and that's why in the other lecture in this unit, it's going to talk a lot about agreement. Agreement on personal political opinions. But it's not just agreement. It's also just sort of the general being with people who are like you. Whether that is about matters of politics, but also in terms of religion, age, race. Things as simple as how often do you drink matter a whole lot in terms of friendships forming and maintaining.